Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Optentia, research entity at the Northwest University, welcome to this book launch and a discussion of the topics dealt with in the book. The book is entitled Global Perspectives on Job Insecurity in Higher Education, Precarity in the Ivory Tower, edited by the wonderful Prof. Lara Roll, Prof. Hans de Witte and Prof. Sebastian Rothman. They are all here, plus other speakers. We'd like to hear from you as well. Since we have all the experts here, we'd love you to ask a few questions and to engage with our experts here online. If you want to, please post a question for us. We'll see it in the comment section of YouTube. So just make sure that you sign into YouTube, and that will allow you to post your questions. We'll then pose them to the different experts here that we have in the room and also online. Let's start things off. It's a wonderful honor always to listen to our director at Optentia, Prof. Sebastian Rothman. It's wonderful to have you here, Prof. And please set the scene of job insecurity, especially then in South Africa.
Good afternoon. I would like to share a little bit of the story behind this book with you. Prof. Hans de Witte, who's here with us and who's one of the authors of the book, is international expert in job insecurity, and he has been involved at this university for quite some time. And years back, she was told Dr. Lara Roll, she's now Professor Lara Roll, joined us for a postdoctoral research fellowship year. And this book was conceptualized. And as you will see on the next slide, we started on 1 December in 2017 with a symposium that was funded by the National Research Foundation. And I took the words that was in the news clip that was on the university website at the time to just show you what we said at the time. So we said that global turmoil raises concerns about job loss among university staff, including both academic and support personnel. In South Africa, we said at that stage, fees must fall, the movement and research grants that were cut, among others, bring challenges on universities. The perception of job insecurity has been identified as a key psychological risk in the working environment, impairing performance, quality, and output. Now, we're also at the time of the symposium, we made a video which is still worthwhile to watch. The name of the video, the title is From Job Insecurity to Job Satisfaction. And if you want to watch this video, please go to the Optentia website, www.optentia.co.za. So this project actually started in 2018, and it took some time to get going with the project at the time. And then the book was finally published this year. So we're talking about 8 years where a lot has been going on, and the project was for about 10 countries and more than 1,000 participants in South Africa joined into this research. Now, I can also say that Prof. Lara Roll made sure that she had very good designs. She had qualitative design, she had a quantitative design, and partly a longitudinal kind of study where she gathered data. Now, the reason for this book and for research about job insecurity is because we need research and intervention. So job insecurity research is about safeguarding the future of higher education, supporting the people who keep the university running, and ensuring that students have access to engaged and motivated staff. Furthermore, we can also say that academic and support staff who worry about the future have less capacity for innovation, less time for mentoring, and less energy for their research. Especially in South Africa for us, where universities are central to social transformation and research capacity is limited, this issue is even more urgent. So financial pressures and restructuring create uncertainty even for those on permanent contracts. And we can also talk about experience of our own university that have gone through some restructuring and the turmoil that might arise even if people know that they won't lose their jobs. So understanding how insecurity affects staff well-being and career development and retention can help universities to support especially early career academics and prevent the loss of skilled scholars to other sectors. I can say that since then, our Faculty of Humanities here at the Northwest University take the initiative to implement mentorship programs, and we have these now on what we call the Glide app, which make courses for mentors and mentees possible at the university, and then specifically it's to support young academics, but also older academics with issues that they have to deal with in life. It won't solve the whole problem of job insecurity. Many systems have to change, and if you really want to deal effectively with job insecurity. But we can say that we are working to prepare both our research and academic staff as well as support staff for the challenges they face through preparing them through mentoring and coaching courses at least. So that is from my side. Thank you. Back to you, Gepe.
Thank you, Prof. Rothman. It's wonderful to have you here. And thank you for that introduction. He also contributed to a few of the chapters, but we have a few people here who did contribute. So thank you so much. From Prof. Rothman, you'll most probably have heard him now mentioning the Faculty of Humanities. So it's a great honor to also have the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Humanities at the Northwest University, to have him here. Prof. Dumi Moyo. Prof. Moyo, thank you so much for joining us and for being part of this book launch. I hand to you to talk a little bit about your experiences and your perspectives on why job insecurity matters. There we go.
Okay. A very good afternoon to you all, and first of all, apologies for running late. I was trying to solve my digital security issues, so luckily I got my computer sorted, but it's really a great pleasure to welcome you to the launch of this very important book titled Global Perspectives on Job Insecurity in Higher Education, Precarity in the Ivory Tower. And I want to thank those who are also joining online for making time to connect to this launch. A special word of welcome also to Professor Hans de Wit from KU Leuven in Belgium, Professor Lara Roll from PwC Belgium. Prof. Roll completed a postdoc with us here at Optentia, and both these colleagues are currently extraordinary professors, also at Optentia here at Northwest University. Now, this book is particularly important when you look at the topic that it covers. It is indeed the largest study that has yet been done on job insecurity at universities, and it gives us a clear evidence of what many have been experiencing, namely that precarious work has become a defining feature of academic work. Here in South Africa, specifically, universities are asked to do more with fewer resources, while still driving social change and producing knowledge. So job insecurity adds strain not only for staff, but for students who rely on stable teaching and mentorship. This is not just a South African problem, as you would have heard from Prof. Ian. Casual contracts, shrinking tenure opportunities, and heavy teaching loads are seen worldwide. This book therefore helps us connect these patterns and see them for what they are, which is a structural issue that needs collective solutions and responses. Now, from where I sit as a dean, I see how instability affects morale, collaboration, and the quality of research and teaching. Precarity pushes talented scholars out of academia and discourages risk-taking, which is the very thing universities need to stay, vibrant and relevant. Interestingly, I was just reading an article by 3 researchers from Makerere University who established that improved job security can enhance academic staff performance in the 3 critical domains of teaching, research, and community engagement. And they recommend that universities prioritize enhancing job security through clear policies and institutional support measures, including competitive remuneration, comprehensive health insurance, I think many of you would like to hear that, and opportunities for career development, while also implementing innovative strategies to foster a stable and supportive work environment that boosts productivity and overall outcomes. These 3 authors, Njikuru, Onen, and Etamori, cite Shi and Wu, who argue that job security is a strong predictor of research productivity, as it reduces anxiety related to job loss and allows academics to focus on long-term projects. In contrast, it is argued that academic staff facing job insecurity may prioritize short-term tasks like teaching over research. So this is a really important study, which really draws our attention to one of those sort of hidden pressures that can actually affect academic work. And we need to really spotlight on this to enhance productivity, to enhance wellness among staff. So in closing, this launch should spark not just reflection, but action. I want to congratulate the authors for their thought leadership and thank them for giving us a framework to begin that work. And I want to thank all of you for joining this conversation this afternoon from wherever you are. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Moyo, and thank you for coming in today and addressing us. Yes, thought leadership indeed, and we have so many on our program. Let's delve right into the book, ladies and gentlemen. And a kind reminder, if you'd like to pose a question, as you hear something that piques your interest, then post that question. We already had congratulations from Ivory on the book, not necessarily on one of our birthdays, because I don't think we are celebrating that now. We're celebrating the book. So thank you, Ivory. You are spot on in your congratulations. I'd love to hear from Professor Lara Roll. Now, Prof. Lara has actually contributed to a few of the chapters. I think, Prof. Lara, my favorite would be chapter 5, but I think you're going to talk a little bit broader than that. Prof. Lara, as you've heard, is from PwC in Belgium. She is involved in people and transformation as a senior consultant, and she is also an extraordinary professor at Optentia here at the Northwest University. Prof. Lara, please give us a bit of a background and an overview of the book.
Certainly. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. So yeah, it's my pleasure to tell you more about the book and the different chapters within the book. As you have already heard from Ian, the idea started in 2018, and who would have guessed that now, almost 8 years later, the topic is still as timely as ever. And also, as Ian has pointed out, even back then, we identified, okay, this is not just a South African problem, this is actually a global issue. And hence, we reached out to colleagues and fellow researchers in the field of job insecurity and asked them if they wanted to embark with us on their journey of researching job insecurity in academia on higher education specifically. And thankfully, a number of colleagues agreed. So here on the slide, we can see the core team from back then. So the different teams that joined from their respective countries. Later on, many more authors joined to develop specific research ideas for individual chapters of the book. And to give you another overview of the different countries that were included. So in total, we had 10 countries spanning 4 of the 6 continents. So from Europe, we had included Belgium, Croatia, Greece, Lithuania, Romania, Switzerland, and the UK. And then we also had from North America, the US, from Africa, South Africa, of course, and then we also had China in Asia. So we had a nice little spread across the globe. And in the book, we go much more into depth into the reasons of why people working in higher education would face job insecurity in those individual countries. However, just to give you a more general perspective on the reasons behind job insecurity, and some of those have already been mentioned. So one very strong reason is the increased use of temporary employment contracts, which often mean that people on temporary employment contracts also receive lower remuneration than their permanent colleagues. And of course, that means they also have fewer opportunities for promotion to actually get out of that situation. Then they have to balance oftentimes a having teaching load with research and increasing administrative burden, which oftentimes leads to stress and challenges to work-life balance. A very famous saying is the publish or perish. So meaning that either you manage to publish despite having a high teaching load and despite all your other service roles, or you may no longer be able to continue your career in academia. Then we have seen a number of headlines in the news in recent times, and my colleagues will also go into that more in terms of budget cuts, which means that there's also more intense competition for the remaining research funding. And lastly, what we have particularly seen during the COVID pandemic, that all of a sudden people had to adapt to new technologies at a very fast pace. And since then, we had the launch of large language models. So all aspects that education cannot ignore and needs to adjust to. But since our core concept for today is job insecurity, I would also like to spend a moment to explain this variable a little bit more. So job insecurity, or someone who experienced job insecurity, is a person who feels threatened in their current job situation. So this feeling is accompanied by perceived powerlessness. And it's very important to mention that this is a subjective perception. So even people who are on a permanent contract can experience job insecurity, for example, for the reason that Prof. Ian also just mentioned, namely, maybe there's a restructuring, and even though you have a permanent contract, if, for example, your whole research area or your whole area in which you have been teaching is cut, this program is no longer offered at the university, then it's also no use if you have a permanent contract at the university. So generally, we can distinguish 2 dimensions of job insecurity, namely quantitative and qualitative job insecurity. So quantitative means if you're afraid of losing your job, so if you are afraid of being terminated. On the other hand, qualitative job insecurity is when you may not be afraid of losing your job, but you might be afraid of losing specific characteristics of your job that you've previously valued. So, for example, maybe you might still be able to keep your job but at a lower pay, or maybe you need to relocate to a different area. So all aspects that could also lead to qualitative job insecurity. Now, for this research, of course, we wanted to conduct research on job insecurity, but then the question was, what other variables are we going to measure? And in the end, we measured all of these variables that I'm displaying to you on the screen right now. So this research model is loosely based on a model developed by or identified by Schoss in her 2017 paper, in which she identified different gaps in the job insecurity literature. But it's not the exact model. We picked aspects that were interesting to us and also added more aspects to it based on our expertise. And so what we measured was, of course, quantitative and qualitative job insecurity, but also different economic stresses, for example, underemployment or recent experience of being unemployed. Then we also looked at different mediators. So those are potential underlying factors that could influence the relationship between job insecurity or economic stressors and potential outcomes. And some of those underlying factors might, for example, be identity threat or justice. And those are aspects that my colleagues will speak about more in later presentations today. We also looked at potential moderators. So those are potential buffering factors. So in other words, factors that might actually maybe make the experience of job insecurity a little bit less bad for individuals, and therefore also mean that there are less or fewer negative outcomes. One example could be participatory decision making. So if you have a voice and a say in what is happening, that this could mean that you experience fewer negative outcomes. And then in terms of outcomes, we measured, for example, outcomes in terms of well-being, like burnout or job satisfaction. We also had a political outcome, and then outcomes that were relevant for the workplace, like, for example, work engagement or counterproductive work behavior. And for this book, we did not systematically research this model. It's rather that this model and all the variables were available to everyone from the different country teams as a core data set. And then we asked everyone to develop a chapter or more than one chapter based on their interests and expertise. So this is what you will find in the final book. Just a few words about the data collection and the sample. So we collected data online through online surveys in the various countries. In total, we had over 4,600 participants. And in addition to the 10 countries, we also looked at 3 different positions that are all present at higher education institutions. So we looked at the academic staff, of course, but also at the experience of support staff and PhD and postdoctoral students. And lastly, I come to the structure of the book. So basically, we can divide the book into 3 different parts. Part 1 is setting the scene. So here we start with an introduction that goes deeper into what I have just told you. But then we also have 2 chapters looking basically at whether what we measure is actually equivalent across the different countries. So basically, these 2 chapters answer the question, can we proceed with our research? Have we measured the same across the different countries? And thankfully, the answer was yes. So that means that we were able to proceed with our analyses. And that leads me to part 2 of the book, in which we examined specific research questions. So here the different teams went into specific questions surrounding job insecurity in higher education. So, for example, one chapter looked at burnout and work engagement. Another chapter looked at self-undermining. One chapter looked at identity threat, and Eva is going to tell us more about that in just a moment. Then we had a chapter looking at innovative work behavior. Another chapter looking at justice, and this is what Jorita is going to talk more about today. And lastly, also performance, about which Hans is going to tell us more. And then we had the third and last part of this book, and here we had more country-specific results. So in other words, two sort of case studies where colleagues went specifically into some research questions concerning China and Greece. And finally, we had the epilogue, so where we had the discussion tying everything in the book together. And this is also what Hans is going to do for us today. So yeah, thank you very much. And as said before, I also welcome any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Prof. Lara. We appreciate your contribution and your contributions in general towards this publication. What wonderful methodology, and what a great starting point to get everybody directed towards contributing to what we have here in the 12 chapters of the book. Now, she mentioned her fellow editor, Professor Hans de Witte, Professor Emeritus at KU Leuven in Belgium, and also then extraordinary professor at Optentia at the Northwest University. I think the extraordinary professorship you've had since 2011, I think, Prof. Hans, it's wonderful to have you here as well to talk to us a little bit about the association between insecurity and performance in academia. Prof. Hans, welcome.
Thank you. I hope my slides, yeah, you can see my slides, I hope.
Yes.
That's great. Thanks for having me. So yes, I will discuss this association between insecurity from one side and then indications of performance in academia. And this is based on a chapter written by my colleagues, well, myself and George and Dragos from Romania. Now, starting with a research question, we always need to start with a research question. There's quite a lot of debate about insecurity and performance and the association between both in the literature. And I think that specifically also in academia, there is a lot of talk about this. And it's a good context to test such a relationship, simply because first, there is a lot of insecurity. I think that Lara just gave some elements there, a lot of governmental cutbacks, temporary contracts, a lot of other aspects. So there's a lot of insecurity. And at the same time, there's a lot of demands on performance. And specifically for a group like academics, this kind of staying in academia is partially conditional on performance. So yeah, this is a good context to analyze this association. And I would like to do it in two ways. I would like to develop some contrasting hypotheses and test them and answer them, obviously. And one is that you sometimes hear that it's a good side. That's a good thing to be insecure because that might be conducive to the development of scientific knowledge. Others, however, say no, it's a problem. It's a bad thing. It could threaten the creation and accumulation of knowledge. And so this is the question I would like to answer. Now, in doing so, we use a very broad operationalization of insecurity and of performance, so we can give a very broad answer to this question. Insecurity relates, as Lara already explained us, to a subjective side, so it could be quantitative insecurity, the threat to lose your job totally, or qualitative insecurity, and I'm not going to lose my job, but I'm a bit afraid that I might lose some valued job characteristics or aspects like income might change, position might change, and so on. So these are two aspects of qualitative insecurity, perceived insecurity, and then some, especially sociologists, would highlight an objective operationalization of insecurity being the employment contract, so temporary or fixed-term contracts in comparison to permanent contracts. So that's three ways of being insecure that we can analyze, and I will analyze the three of them, and I'll look at 4 ways of performance. And performance can relate to productive performance or work behaviors, that is doing the job you need to do in order to reach the goals of the organization. And then there's also counterproductive behavior, that is the opposite, that is doing behaviors that are not making you reach the goals, that make it more difficult to reach those goals. Typical productive behaviors is in-role behavior, doing the job as prescribed, but also extra role behaviors, doing something additional, going the extra mile, like being altruistic, that is not necessarily part of your job, at least not into the formal job description, but it of course helps reaching the goals of the organization. And you could say that the third aspect, innovative work behavior, is also an in-role or is also a productive way of behaving, work behavior in academia, because it relates to the generation and implementation of ideas. And that's exactly what academics normally should do. Counterproductive behaviors are all the bad behaviors that make it more difficult to reach those goals. In this study, we have been measuring milder behaviors like working slower. You could also measure more aggressive, negative behaviors like mobbing people, sabotage, and so on. That's not what we did, but that's also part of counterproductive behaviors. So we have a broad set of performance indicators. Now, the hypothesis, there is two sets of big hypotheses. One set relates to the direct effects. What are the direct, immediate relationships between insecurity, or the three kinds of insecurity, and the performance outcomes? And you can look at it in the negative way or in the positive way. So we have a negative path, and that's the path of a hindrance stressor. And I think that in the book, we have some authors who have been nicely explaining the reasons why there could be a negative path, why performance could be lower because of insecurity. And that relates, of course, to the fact that that this kind of hindrance stressors takes a lot of energy, it exhausts people, and that leads them to not being able to perform well because, for instance, their needs are deprived, but also to not really willing to invest in performance because, for instance, they feel that their psychological contract has been breached. They are entitled to more than they get, and they feel embarrassed, so they might not put in all the efforts they would normally do. And so it's about inability and unwillingness, and that leads to the first negative hypothesis: insecurity will be associated with reduced performance. That is, if you look at the empirical evidence, something that you would typically find for subjective job insecurity. It's been well documented in meta-analysis. It's a bit less clear for the contractual side of operationalization. If you look at the employment contract, the evidence is a bit less conclusive there. But it's clearly conclusive regarding the subjective insecurity. So that's the negative side. Now, of course, one could also develop a positive hypothesis, stating that insecurity could be a challenge stressor. And challenge stressors are typical, these kind of stressors that are ambivalent. So they are negative because they take energy, they're demanding, but at the same time, they could perhaps also be stimulating. They could also be giving you some energy, motivate you, making you want to develop more, and so on. So it could be a kind of positive and negative thing at the same time. At least that's the hypothesis. This, to a certain degree, but it's not absolutely identical, ties in with the logic that has been mentioned by Mindy Schoss in her overview article about job preservation motivation, where she states, well, people who are insecure might put in extra efforts, and they might refrain from risk behaviors, from negative behaviors, to avoid being dismissed. And if it relates to the permanent contract, it could be to gain a permanent contract. And so it might lead to positive behaviors. So the hypothesis here would be insecurity might be associated with increased performance. The empirical evidence, as stated before, is a bit weak regarding job insecurity. Sometimes in specific situations among specific groups, one finds traces of this kind of positive associations, but normally we don't. Regarding the contract, the evidence is absolutely inconclusive. So evidence is a bit mixed, but okay, let's have it as an hypothesis. So this is the direct hypothesis. Now, stay with me because it's going to become slightly more complex, because you could also look at interactions. We have two kinds of insecurity. You have the objective insecurity, contract, and you have subjective insecurity, perceiving insecurity. Now, how do the two combine? And this could be done in two ways. And then for each way, there could be a positive and a negative path. One way is that they could just strengthen each other, one on top of the other. It's much more, much stronger effects. Okay? So we will call that the intensification hypothesis. And so, in a way, you could say it also means that if you have a temporary contract, it will even become worse if you also feel insecure. So one on top of the other makes it more strong. Now, as I developed two kind of hypotheses, a positive and a negative path, so there was a hindrance and a challenge hypothesis. The association of productive for the temporary contract security, the contract makes you work less. Or it could be a challenge intensification. If it's a positive path, then the positive association of insecurity with productive behaviors could be stronger for the temporary contracts. So that is one way, a kind of one strengthens the other. However, in the literature in the past, we've also found evidence of violation. And violation relates to the psychological contract and the fact that that contract has been breached. Psychological contract breach means I'm expecting something and I don't get it. And as a consequence, I react much more negative or perhaps much more positive. The logic here is that temporary people with a temporary contract, they might not expect that much security. Whereas people with a permanent contract, they really expect security in exchange for their efforts and their loyalty. And if they suddenly are insecure in their jobs, this is a psychological contract breach. And of course, that makes the effects much more strongly. So one might, in this hypothesis, expect the most strong effects for the permanent workers, those with a permanent contract, rather than for the temporary workers. And because we have two paths, this could be a hindrance violation. So the negative association would be stronger for the permanent workers, or a challenge violation. The positive association might be stronger for the permanent workers. So quite a lot of hypotheses. A small word about method. We know the method by now for partly because, well, we know that it's a very big data set with 10 countries, and we've been did analyze the data, and this is separately for each professional category. So we have regression analysis for the professors, academics, for the PhD students, and for the postdocs, and then for the administrative staff. And we do it separately because these are different groups with perhaps different combinations. There's different demographics behind each group, but also you could say that the administrative group is perhaps more similar to the general population of white-collar workers, whereas professors and the PhD students, they are the prototypical academics, and perhaps this kind of logic as to they have to publish or perish might apply stronger, even stronger for them than for the others. So in a way, administrative staff is a kind of comparison category here. And then we have employment contract, obviously temporary versus permanent workers. Let's go for the results. The results, well, there's a lot of results to show. I tried to summarize that in just one table. Regarding the direct effects, the main effects, you have horizontally, you have quantitative insecurity, qualitative, and temporary contracts. They have all been added at the same time in the regressions. And we look at the vertical variables, three kinds of productive and one counterproductive behavior. What you first of all see is that 25% of all relationships were significant. So it's not always that we find an effect. We only find one quarter of the effects that are significant. If there's a significant effect, we only find hindrance effects, and that's already a first important conclusion. If you look at the specific variables, then you see that it's mainly quantitative job insecurity doing the trick rather than qualitative job insecurity. And it's mainly in-role behaviors that have been affected rather than the others. And if you look at the cell at the left upper side of my table, you see that all tests of quantitative insecurity with in-role behaviors have been significant for each professional group. So we always typically find a hindrance effect there, less so in all the other cells. The professors, they show some negative consequences of insecurity regarding innovative work behaviors. And that's rather important to state because innovative work behaviors are a core issue in academia, one could expect. So if they're quantitatively insecure, if they have a temporary contract, performance, innovative work behaviors go down. And then you see that some other groups also have some effects here and there, especially the administrative stuff shows effects of qualitative job insecurity, which is a bit surprising because you don't find it in any of the other groups. Let's go to the interactions. Here again, I summarized it. Again, 25% of the interactions seem to be significant, and it's mainly hindrance, but not just hindrance. And perhaps I will just give it, tell you this results in words. We found 6 interactions that were significant. 5 of them were typically hindrance violation interactions, as we found them before in the literature. That is, the strongest effects are for the permanent workers, probably because they were expecting security, didn't get it, and they feel embarrassed. So they are unable or unwilling to perform well. And just to give you a figure, this is an illustration of one of those interactions. You see those horizontally here, you see low insecurity, high insecurity horizontally, and it's about in-role behaviors. You see that the temporary contracts, those with a temporary contracts, there's not much of an association between insecurity and in-role behavior. Whereas for the permanent contracts, so those with a permanent contract, insecurity is associated with a lower level of in-role behaviors. And this we find 5 times, and this is very much in accordance to the literature. However, and it's only 1 time, we find 1 indication of perhaps challenge intensification. And I'll show you the figure which makes it easier to look. It was among the professors regarding innovative work behavior. Those with a permanent contract didn't show an association with innovative work behavior regarding quantitative insecurity. So if they were insecure or not, it didn't matter that much. It's for the temporary, where you can see that temporary professors increased their innovative work behavior slightly if they became more insecure. Now, the interesting bit is, before you think, okay, now we need to give all professors a temporary contract, it seems like they are just catching up their backlog. So they were already lower on innovative work behavior, and if they become a bit more insecure, then they become as innovative as the permanent workers were in the same situation. So in a way, you could state, if you had given them a permanent contract in the first place, you wouldn't have found this. But well, so again, this is mainly about interactions with quantitative insecurity, less with qualitative insecurity, and it's mainly related to in-role behaviors. So this is a very striking thing, and I'm coming to my conclusion because I probably took too much time already. Take-home message here. Insecurity is a hindrance for performance in academia. That is really in line with previous meta-analysis. It's especially so for quantitative insecurity and for in-role behavior and their combination. And quite striking is that for the professors, quantitative insecurity and temporary contracts independently also are negatively associated with innovative work behavior. So no, insecurity is not conducive to the development or accumulation of scientific knowledge. It rather threatens their creation and dissemination. And as far as interactions were concerned, well, they were mostly in line with this psychological breach logic, suggesting that they were worse, that worse results were found among the permanent workers when they were insecure. With the tiny exception, perhaps, of the innovative work behavior with the professors that I just discussed a moment ago. So that's it for regarding what I wanted to discuss at this moment.
Prof. Hans, I wish we could sing to you, "We have all the time in the world," but we don't. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. We really appreciated the rigor that you put into the research. It is something to behold, and thank you for your contribution of that. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we've heard from the three editors of this book, Global Perspectives on Job Insecurity in Higher Education. Let's hear from the other authors who contributed to the chapters that we have in the book. So, from Belgium, buckle your seatbelts. We're going to fly over to England and Loughborough University, specifically to hear from Professor Eva Selenko, Head of Work and Organization Group at that university. And I think she's going to tell us a little bit about what is chapter 6 in the book, entitled "Job Insecurity Among Academics Can Become an Identity Threat." Prof. Eva, thank you so much for availing yourself and for talking to us this afternoon.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to this interesting symposium. Can you see you can see my slides?
Yes, yes, we can. Thank you.
Super. So first of all, I'd like to thank Lara and Hans and Sebastian, Professor Rothman, Professor De Witte, and Professor Roll for inviting me to this book. It was amazing to be able to work with you guys on this, such an important topic. Thank you also to Professor Dumi for giving me the possibility to talk to you today on my chapter of the book, which is going to focus on two things, actually. So I'm going to introduce you to a possible explanation as to why job insecurity is so bad for us. And as well, I would like to make a case why it is particularly bad for academics. Okay, so I'm a professor in work psychology. I work at Loughborough University, that's in the UK, and I was responsible for the UK part of the data collection. So we have heard already, and I think I don't need to make this point, but job insecurity is pervasive in academia, and it's a pervasive problem. And in some countries and some disciplines, it's particularly bad. Some of you might be familiar with the Ich bin Hanna hashtag. Action has been going on in Germany, highlighting the fate of young junior academics and their impossibility to land a secure job. This is a graph here from anthropologists, actually, who did a survey and found, there's so few permanent positions, and most of them, the purple ones, are in temporary positions. And we also have heard that, as it seems, temporary contracts might be on the rise. So this is data from the Netherlands, 2022, and we see here, among the different job groups, among professors, it's decreasing. But if we have a look at the green line, for example, these are different research positions. It's been going up. Temporary positions been going up. Among the docents, that's teaching staff, it's been going up. So it's a problem. It's a problem in many different countries, and it's a problem in different institutions, even in so-called highly prestigious institutions. This is data from Cambridge. And you can see how the temporary contracts, permanent contracts have been decreasing and temporary contracts have been increasing. And I think, this is a hot topic, not just 2017 when we started this research, but also now when we see universities under pressure for cutting jobs because of financial pressures, but also under political pressures and resulting funding cuts and income losses of universities. And Professor Dumi alluded to that. So job insecurity is a hot topic, and it's going on. And this is a headline from 2025, by the way, right? These are all from 2025. So it's a thing, okay. And my argument is that job insecurity is bad, yes, but it might be particularly bad for academics. These are some, as we know at the universities, we have different people working there, right? We have academic staff. This is our Vice Chancellor here. We've got people working in services, people working in administration, etc. So it's a quite big business, actually, an organization like that. And of course, job insecurity will be bad for everybody because, as I will make the case, it affects our self, our identity in a way. But we also know that academics are particularly highly identified with their job. And so their job insecurity might be particularly bad on that. Okay, so the argument I'm going to bring is job insecurity constitutes an identity threat, and it may therefore be particularly hard for academics. Then I will present some data from the 10-country study. And finally, the great reveal with some conclusions and recommendations. Okay, I know I'm looking at the time and I try to talk fast. I hope I'm not talking too fast here. But let me first of all introduce you to this idea of job insecurity threatening who we are, okay? So this is an idea we have been developing since 2017 with various authors. And the basic idea is, well, when we look at ourselves and we say, okay, how would you describe yourself? Identity is basically the answer to the question, who are you? And of course, you can give different answers to this question, right? You can say, oh, I'm a mother or a father with a family, or I am from a specific country. Or you could say, I'm a Christian, or I'm a Muslim, or I'm a Jew. Or you could define yourself through, hobbies or party affiliations or things that you do in your free time. So basically, there are some very fixed memberships that we have, like our passports to certain countries. Some memberships that we are very, very identified with, that are very important to us. Let's say our family relationships, for example, or our beliefs. And then there are others that are perhaps more flexible and less, maybe, self-defining for us. The important thing here, and this is not just said by me, this is old social psychological knowledge, is that these social group membership inform our values, and so what we find as normal, what we expect, our behaviors and our well-being. Okay, because we know then whom to turn to, right? When we need support, then we know what's right or wrong because we look to others in our group. We know, what to think about things because we can look at others in our group. Anyway, my point is that work, and I mean everything associated with it, my organization, my occupation, the things I do, my job role, all of this can be answers to the question, who are you? And actually, I think work is a very important category here because we spend most of our time at work, right? When we look at adult lives in Europe and in industrialized countries, we spend apparently, over 70% of our time at work in work-related activities. May that be employed work, may that be self-supported work, self-employed work, portfolio work, that's work. So basically, we just spend a lot of time with this thing. So naturally, by doing it a lot, we will also, when we think about who are we, I look back to my day and I say, well, I'm working, right? I'm a professor in work psychology. So there are certain things that actually enhance our identification, right? And these are things like, if you're interested in reading this, I'd suggest you start with this one, PROS 2024, A Docent's Guide to Identity. It's a very short paper, very crisp, gives you an idea of this thing. Basically, there are certain things that make it more likely that we identify with something, right? So if we do it a lot, so if we basically share a lot of time with this activity work, if we feel part of a community, and it also makes us more likely to identify with this. If this community has high status and validation, right? And if it's difficult to get into, for example, and also especially if we feel under threat, if there is a threat situation, a competition situation. So my argument now is that academic careers are particularly lend themselves to identify highly, okay? So hang on, I'll try to make a case here, okay? So first of all, an academic career is very selective and very difficult to get into, right? I looked this up and basically what's normal according to the internet is that you get your first academic position after 10 years of education. I mean, just count it up, right? 3 years of a bachelor, 1 year of a master's here in the UK, then maybe 3 or 4 years as a PhD student, then you will have some postdocs. So you basically, if you land a lectureship, probably after 10 years of studying education, so long education, right? Professorships, even longer, right? It's the highest rank, so can take 20 plus years, okay? So it's very long education trajectories. Also, you spend a lot of time doing it, right? So we know as academics, we're used to working very long hours. So you're basically practicing those schemas as part of self-understandings. We also have a lot of autonomy and ownership of our work. We also know that, well, there's a lot of threat and competition in our profession. So basically, our journals have 90% rejection rates. Landing a grant in competitive times is similarly with similar rejection rates. So it's a very long process, very highly competitive to be successful in academia. And then there's these, we always feel as a we, right? There's communities, there's conferences, collaborators. So you work in a very tight-knit, very small world, actually, okay? And then finally, well, at least to some degree, I think we are still regarded as, highly, we have high status to some degree, okay? Some even call us a prestige economy. All we have as academics is often just our prestige, right? We don't have money, we don't have millions, we don't have influence, but we have prestige. Okay, so all of this lends itself that people identify highly with the occupation and probably with the broader category also, like, being part of something bigger, being part of the working population. My position is now that when job insecurity hits, this starts to wobble. Okay, so let's have a look at the research. Basically, if you want to draw it up as a statistical model, that's what I did, is, well, I propose that basically having an academic contract will lead to more identification with the occupation and the working population. And job insecurity, however, will reduce that identification with the working population. And we found evidence for that in previous studies. And we also know that these identifications, the identity aspects, are connected to well-being. So we found evidence for that through in various other studies with different measures of well-being, but I was wondering whether it would also be true for burnout. Okay, so just to run you very quickly through the methods, and then I'm gonna blast you with a few numbers, okay? So just some methods, because these are probably the more unusual things and people are maybe you find this interesting, I hope you do. So basically, how did we measure this, right? So we asked people, how identified are you with the job, right? And these are 3 questions adapted from a very well-reputable scale and had very good reliabilities across the different countries, and basically says, okay, my job is a central part of my identity. People have then to agree or disagree on a 5-point scale. My job defines where I am. My personal identity is defined by my job. So you can see, if people answer, to a high degree here, give a high value, they really think, okay, my job is part of who I am. Okay. Then we also measured social identity with the working population. This is basically asking, how much do you see yourself part of, let's say, South Africa's workforce? Or, how pleased are you to be part of South Africa's workforce? So, right, you're working, but do you feel yourself as part of the bigger whole? Okay. We were controlling for financial strain and for previous unemployment experience, because I thought that these factors have been shown to negatively affect people's identification with the job and with their work. Okay. Academic role, we also looked at that, of course, and here we differentiated between people in the professoriate, so people who were lecturer, researchers, or teachers, versus people on non-academic positions. So these were academic support staff, but also PhD students, because we thought that in different countries, PhD students are given different types of tasks. In some countries, PhD students are like junior faculty, and in others, they're really just like students. So, and not on an income. So that's why we separated them out. Okay, let me briefly show you just some correlations, because I'm a fan of very, very simple analysis, because I think if you cannot see it in simple terms, why show complicated things? So first of all, yes, we see some confirmation here. Okay, we see that the academic role, so a higher value here, 1 is academic and 0 means non-academic, correlates positively with these identification measures. So that's already promising, right? We also see that job insecurity, quantitatively and qualitatively, Hans just explained that, correlates with these identification measures negatively, as we suspected, right? So we were thinking that people who are insecure would feel less part of the working population and would identify less with the job. These are all the people taken together, so across the whole sample. This is not country-specific data. Okay, we already see something weird going on here, but more about that later. And finally, I was predicting that basically those identification measures would correlate with burnout. So the more you identify with your job and the more you identify with the working population, the less burnout there would be. And this is promising. Okay, let me show you some very awful tables. Okay, first of all, what we found was this: academics identify more strongly with the job. So, and I found this a really nice result. So if we look at the overall sample plus all the individual countries except for China, we find that people on an academic contract, okay, were more highly identified with the job. So the dependent variable, these are regression results here, okay, regression coefficients for those of you who are stats fans, and our dependent variable was identification with the job. So indeed, our hypothesis that academics would identify more strongly with the job is coming true, okay? We also found that qualitative job insecurity threatens this identification with the job, at least in some countries and in the overall sample, okay? So you see not all of those are significant. You can see there's no stars here, okay? But overall it is. We also see some weird stuff, okay, that I cannot explain, right? Why is quantitative job insecurity positively associated with this, especially in Switzerland? Maybe Mikey can tell us. Okay, let's move on. We also see that academics and non-academics identify similarly with the working population. Actually, I thought this is a nice finding. So it's non-significant. There's no difference between whether you're a professor, whether you're a PhD student, whether you're admin staff, with how strongly you identify with the working population. And honestly, why should you, right? Because we are all part of the working population. Everybody of us has as much right to it as, you know, as anybody else. Only in Romania, we see a slight effect here. Okay. And we also find that there is qualitative job insecurity threatens this identification. Okay, this is what I would expect for all professional groups. Again, there were some weird things, right? Why didn't quantitative job insecurity work? But hey ho, okay, this is what data is. It's not clear, it's always messy. Okay, and finally, we're gonna look at this table. And what we find here is that qualitative job insecurity and low identification relate to burnout in most countries. So this is the prediction of burnout across all different countries. You see here against the regression coefficients here. And what we find here across all different countries, identification with the working population led to more burnout. So the less identification, the more burnout you had, okay? And again, there were some quite weird direct effects. So just in conclusion, let's summarize this graphically, I thought, okay, and this is probably better than do it the other way around. This was our statistical model, okay. What we can say at least is that academics identify more highly with their jobs than other workers at university. I think this in itself is an interesting finding. It's quite robust. It's found across different countries. It's found if we merge all the data, so quite robust. I think this is a particular risk in time of job insecurity. We find in this study among all the samples and among specific countries that qualitative job insecurity will lead to less identification with the working population as predicted. So the thick lines are basically as predicted. The broken lines are unexpected effects, okay? We also find that job insecurity with qualitative job insecurity will lead to less identification with the job. So this is also across the overall sample, and especially in South Africa and also in Croatia. Okay. And we also find that identification with the working population led to less burnout. So someone who identifies strongly as a member of their country experiences less burnout. Really interesting, I thought. This was found in the overall sample, but also in the UK, South Africa, Romania, Lithuania, and Croatia. Okay, but you see, there's still a lot of mess going on, right? The dotted lines are the unexpected effects, okay? So there's definitely room for more research here. If you're interested in getting engaged, please reach out, okay? We do not know about causality. This is, you know, the area pointed in one direction, but causality could just be the other way around. We don't know underlying mechanisms, and I really do not understand the country differences because, yeah, there's many things to add. Okay, so this is all from me. Thank you very much. Do you have any questions, comments, and thoughts? If you have them, please ask them later or send me an email. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prof. Eva. You've certainly engaged us on this chapter of yours. It's fascinating, and we all can't wait to read it in the book as well. Prof. Eva asked you for any questions. I remind you to please post them. We already have one waiting, so we're looking for more as well. Thank you, Prof. Eva. That was wonderful. On chapter 6 in the book, your seatbelts, please, because now we're flying over to Lithuania. Can you believe it? And we're going to listen to Professor Jurgita Lazauskaite-Zabielske, the head at the Organizational Psychology Research Center at Vilnius University. Professor Jurgita, now I was hoping for chapter 5, Professor, but it seems if you're going to focus on chapter 8 in the book, Insecurity and Justice in Academia, Exploring the Interplay. Prof. Jurgita, thank you for your time. You have the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for such a nice introduction. I'm just uploading my slides. I hope it works. Yeah. Wonderful. So let me take you to Lithuania, faraway country. I was very upset listening to you when you said no, academics don't get millions, and so I was hopeful. Yes. Just to introduce where I'm coming from a very nice country. This morning, a fox has stolen the shoes that were put outside the house. So it's not my last shoes, luckily. But you see, it's a wild country with a lot of wild animals. So I would like to briefly present the chapter that me and my colleague Yeva has prepared on insecurity and justice. Yeva is currently busy giving lectures, unfortunately, so she was not able to come. I don't want to talk a lot about the results. I don't want to spoil the pleasure of reading the book. A pleasure of reading paper book, hardcover paper book. I think that's a quite rare these days. But I want to really pique your interest in not in insecurity that we might experience quite often, but in justice, because justice is a topic that I was involved in for like many years, and I was really grateful for this opportunity to see how these two phenomena interact with each other. So. This chapter, first of all, presents theoretical perspectives that really highlight the complexity of the relationship between job insecurity and justice. And we put a specific emphasis on overall justice as such. Why overall? Well, you might know that justice has many faces in organization. We can talk about justice of the outcomes or distributive justice. We can talk the justice of procedures. I mean, how fairly we make some decisions. That would be procedural justice. And we can talk about interactional justice or interpersonal justice that refers to fairness of interpersonal treatment. And in this chapter, in this study, we chose to focus on overall justice that refers to individuals' global assessment of the fairness of social entity. In other words, it's a fairness of organization, academic organization as a whole. In line with existing theories and also studies, we suggest that overall justice captures individuals' justice experiences more accurately, and it might indeed help to overcome some limitations, because even if employees might distinguish between fair outcomes, fair procedures, or fair people, still when you talk about everyday decisions, it's usually the general feeling of fairness or justice that guides your attitudes, emotions, and behaviors in an organization. So the first part, the biggest part of the chapter, is analyze the relationship between insecurity and justice, because they're not so simple, as I will tell you just in a few moments. Then we draw on empirical evidence from a huge data set, cross-sectional data set coming from 10 countries that Lara has just presented. And well, I will tell you what the results more or less were found. And well, naturally, we finished the chapter with implications and suggestions for future research, as it appeared that insecurity and justice has complicated relationships after all. So I really hope that with this chapter we could shed more light on the on how justice might help to fight job insecurity in academia. So let's start, from some interesting things. So when we talk, I think that justice is important for everyone, because even children know what is fair and unfair. It's a feeling that in any social interaction we really come up very quickly. And as far as I know, there are even some research on animal research showing that animals, they do understand what is fair and unfair, and all living organisms seek fairness. So usually when we talk about fairness and insecurity, the main interest is now that justice might prevent insecurity from occurring. Perhaps it might be true. So why could it be? Why could it happen this way? Because, well, if you look at the organization, justice is about, having rules and adhering to those rules. So it means that, well, at least it might mean two things. It has, when you know the rules and they are in action, you can predict the outcomes that you might get in the social interactions and organizations. So, and this way, you get to know the instrumental role of justice. You control the outcome and the environment. And the other reason for fairness to be important is that you feel the valuable member of any social entity or organization or academia in this place here. So if you have fair organization, then you know what to expect and you feel valued member of that of this organization. So when you look about when you look at insecurity, insecurity threatens your position in organization, your resources, and well, social resources as well. So you might not really, it signals that you are not so valued, and you might even be out of this organization if you mean if you talk about quantitative job insecurity. So really, some studies has demonstrated that perceived fairness of employee treatment during organizational change in the past helps to maintain employee positive attitudes and diminishes insecurity in the future. Okay, so if we have experience of fair treatment, that it transfers to our later evaluation of situations that we come up with, because in every day in organization we face a lot of events and we evaluate those events also in terms of justice. So we have some really studies showing that yes, justice might prevent insecurity from occurring in the first place. However, there are also other studies, and another way to look at the relationship between insecurity and fairness. And this way is offered, first of all, by social exchange perspective that posits job insecurity as the imbalance in the exchange relationship between employee and employer, and suggests that in really perceived justice might act as a mediational mechanism for the insecurity outcome relationship. In other words, it's, well, to put it simply, if you experience insecurity, you lose your faith and justice in organization. Why is that so? Because, well, when employees experience insecurity, it signals that there's really a change in the exchange relationship on the part of organization. So you might lose your job or any positive aspect of your employment. And so if before you did not have this experience, you might have considered organization as fair, then insecurity might may you rethink your experience in employment relationship, and it's very natural that you really might change your evaluation of fairness. So I really like the arguments posited by fairness heuristic theory and uncertainty management theory. According to these theories and these models, we as human beings or employees in any social entity very quickly try to form the impression of justice, so that we know how to behave ourselves and how to cooperate or not cooperate in work context or in any social group. Why is that? It is what in every interaction we are solving what Lind called fundamental social dilemma, because in any interaction you have to decide whether to cooperate and what you might get and what you might lose if you do not, if your cooperation is not reciprocated. Yeah. So if you acting in a fair organization, you know that your all the endeavors will be rewarded and rewarded fairly. So this way justice promotes cooperation really well. So in some during our, let's say, working life, when we face insecurity, it shows that social exchange doesn't work, and you really have to change that, to change your relationship and to change your behavior in solving this social dilemma. So I think that from practical point of view, in this case, insecurity is really detrimental, because it not only has the bad outcomes like diminishing performance or impairing social identity or whatever, but it really impairs person's impression of cooperation and contribution to organization as a whole, and it might really extend to other organizations as well. And the third way to look at justice and insecurity that we have tried in this in this chapter, and to support with empirical data, is that we try to look at interaction between perceived justice and insecurity. So I think it's very important, a very interesting thing, because we usually think that when you we expect justice to mitigate the negative effects of job insecurity in terms that, well, if you're acting in a fair organization, then when you usually get what you want and everyone gets what they deserve, so any events that triggers insecurity is not so harmful to you. So when you look at the empirical data, they partly support this assumption. But what we found more interesting is that some ideas and some empirical facts coming from the data as well, is that also in fair organizations, people might be more sensitive to insecurity issues. That is, insecurity might even have more detrimental effects when people are experiencing it in fair organizations. So we try to look at the interaction between justice and insecurity and to see whether justice might really buffer the negative effects of insecurity, or it might be even more harmful under conditions of fair organization. So we took a very nice sample from 10 countries. I think it's also very wonderful. I mean, to have so many countries and coming from all over the globe, and even if we have like different countries, these are all academics. Yeah. So with more than 4,000 employees from academia, and so we checked the interaction between justice and insecurity. So what have we got there? Very interesting things. Following our expectations, insecurity, both types of insecurity were negatively related to job satisfaction, job performance, and work engagement, and positively related to burnout. So it's very natural. On the other hand, fairness was related positive to work engagement, job performance, and job satisfaction, and negatively related to burnout. But the results concerning the remaining outcomes were absolutely contrary to our assumption. So instead of buffering negative associations between insecurity and performance and work engagement, overall justice exacerbated the job insecurity's negative effect on these outcomes. Moreover, the positive relation between insecurity and burnout was stronger when overall justice was high. So wonderful. In fair organizations, it means that people pay more attention to insecurity. And even if, like, from logical point of view, these results seem a bit, out of logic, out of expectations. Anyway, as a major stressor, job insecurity is obviously an unfavorable experience, implying adverse outcomes. So if we might just infer that in high justice conditions, the very occurrence of job insecurity is experienced as particularly stressful because it contradicts the very idea of the organization. And consequently, that drains employees' energetic resources when coping with it. So I think that from practical point of view, that I want you to inspire to think also from practical point of view about these results. We really need to find ways to fight insecurity. I think we cannot forget, because this is really feasible. I mean, offering employment security is really feasible. We have just to wish for that. So all the things that lead to less insecurity and more justice, like transparent decision-making procedures, explicit communication, or fair treatment, is in favor of lower insecurity and higher justice. And also, it is also very important to enhance justice, and to do that on everyday basis. We cannot forget that we might think about, participative decision making, about some procedures, about some processes that might be designed as fair. But it's also everyday treatment by, for example, supervisors, respectful and personal treatment. That's also important. And the last note that I always put for myself is that we have to take care of everyday justice. Because the organization is comprised of everyday events, and do that every day. I think that our studies show, and this chapter presents very important results. And very important idea is that you cannot rely on the existing fairness of organizations, saying that we have done everything correctly, we communicate openly, and we have transparent decision-making procedures, because at some level, negative events such as insecurity might really threaten the justice, and then the outcomes might be even worse and worse. So it's not that, no, it's not a safeguard. Justice is not a safeguard, but it's really a living phenomenon that you have to take care of every day and really do your best in this from this point of view. So I really urge you to explore the book for deeper insight, natural, not only this chapter, but all other chapters, and to really have this no pleasure of reading the text that really we put a lot of effort in gathering data and preparing and providing you with the best knowledge we can and our expertise. So thank you. I hope that I'm on time. Stop sharing.
Jurgita, thank you so much. We really enjoyed your presentation, found it very engaging. And it's a pity you weren't here yesterday, because then we would have been able to chat over this. You'll have to come and visit us at the Northwest University here in South Africa. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, all the way from Lithuania. Prof. Jurgita, thank you so much. Now, Prof. Hans, we've heard from a few people contributing to the different chapters in the book. Now we are in your hands to provide us with a few overall conclusions of the book and perhaps a few recommendations. Prof. Hans? Prof. Hans, we can't hear you. Just make sure that you're unmuted.
Exactly. Apologies. I was too fast in sharing. Okay, so yeah, I will try to make some overall conclusions. Of course, the book is bigger than what we heard today. We could only have 3 chapters and an introduction presented. So now I will try to give you an overall a conclusion, or summarizing some overall patterns. So not really into the country specifics, but on the overall. And I'll discuss insecurity, or independent variable, and its dimensionality, and then its associations with well-being and performance, as according to what we can find overall in the various chapters. The book looks at explanations. We have been hearing some of them today, and it looks at boundary conditions, moderators. So I will try to summarize some of that. And then I'll also look into the difference between the 3 professional categories, because of course, we have 3 different groups within academia. That makes academia rather interesting. And the question is, do we find the same thing for all of these groups? Then I'll end with suggestions for policy practice and some take-home message. Now, insecurity in academia, I don't need to repeat it, but it's on my slides. We know that it comes in many forms. We have objective insecurity, temporary contracts, and subjective, 2 kinds. And as far as this subjective or perceived job insecurity is concerned, there is a bit of a debate in the literature about the dimensionality. So is it mainly about cognitive versus affective insecurity? So cognitive is people perceive, they give them a probability of being fired, for instance, or is it about the worries related to this threat or perception of threat, or is it about quantitative versus qualitative insecurity? As we already explained. So there is a bit of a debate. Some say no, the most important dimension is cognitive affective. Others say no, it's quantitative qualitative. We did a rigorous test in the book, and the qualitative quantitative dimensionality is really more prominent than the cognitive affective one. And so that's perhaps, for scientists at least, a very important conclusion. Second, if we have insecurity, 2 kinds, is there insecurity? And we haven't been discussing these figures at the moment, so I brought you some percentages here. It is only a minority, but it is a substantial minority who really feels insecure into academia. And I brought you some illustrative items, and mind you, I've been selecting the items with the highest percentages. So I'm a bit showing it to the upper side. If you look, for instance, at the item, I feel insecure about the future of my job, a quantitative job insecurity item, about 1/3 of the respondents overall said that they felt, that they agreed, that they felt insecure. And it's almost 40% if you take the qualitative item, I feel insecure about the characteristics and conditions of my job in the future. Now, of course, you might think now that A very, very big group is feeling insecure. It depends on the item. If you have the item, chances are I will soon lose my job. Only 11% says yes. So in short, there is insecurity, but it's a minority, even though that is a substantial minority. That's one conclusion. The second is that there is more qualitative insecurity than quantitative insecurity, and that's something that you will find in the general population as well. And so qualitatively, people feel more insecure than quantitatively. Okay, how do these insecurity aspects relate to well-being and performance? And first of all, there is a striking finding overall in the book that, of course, both kinds of insecurity are relevant for well-being and performance, but qualitative insecurity seemed to be more important for well-being than quantitative insecurity. So it is mainly qualitative insecurity that was associated with job satisfaction, burnout complaints, work engagement. Whereas, as I've already shown, quantitative insecurity seems to be more important for performance than qualitative insecurity. And that's a striking differentiation that we typically do not find in the broader population. So this might be typical for academia. We don't know exactly why it happens this way, but it's worthwhile mentioning. And of course, it also means that if you do research on insecurity, do measure both aspects of insecurity because both matter and perhaps for different outcomes. Now, they have associations, but what are the associations? Well, the associations are rather robust and really according to what we already know in the population. In general, you could say that insecurity endangers the creation of scientific knowledge, as already has been stated in the opening of this meeting today. It is bad, insecurity is bad for health and well-being, and so it's associated with lower job satisfaction, lower work engagement, lower mental health, lower mental well-being, and with increased burnout complaints. A small note, however, we always say that academia all have very, very negative health and well-being. That is not true. If you look at specific findings in a chapter, positive well-being dominates in academia. If you combine burnout complaints and work engagement, then you would find 70% of the respondents being engaged and only 8% being exhausted. So dominantly, the picture is positive, but insecurity is associated with the bad side. And it's also associated with lower levels of performance and for specific aspects, higher levels of counterproductive behavior. So it's a bad thing. How can we explain this? Well, there's a lot of explanations already been offered in the literature in this book. We've mainly been testing innovative explanations, like it could relate to insecurity, could relate to self-undermining, creating obstacles, and they will then relate to lower performance. It relates to burnout, which then, of course, also reduces performance, or it relates to threats in identity, which leads to burnout and then lower performance, as already been discussed by Eva Selenko. Now, we have three new ideas. I must say, however, if you look at the overall evidence, not all hypotheses were corroborated. We do find traces of this, but not always. And it's very interesting to see that the explanations advanced in the book now were more relevant in explaining qualitative job insecurity rather than quantitative insecurity. So there, at least, there is a new way of looking. And of course, this might create negative spirals. Insecurity affects something that then has even worse outcomes, and then the whole cycle might start up again. We've also been looking at boundary conditions or at moderators in the book. Here again, we look at variables that reduce the negative consequences. Jurgita has been discussing one of those. My overall conclusion perhaps was that good moderators are often very hard to find because quite often we found the opposite to expectations. We have been analyzing justice perceptions, already just been discussed, prevention focus, more personality kind of trait, and workplace social capital. They were advanced as moderators. They did not always do the trick as expected. So it's a bit difficult to find good moderators. We also had the employment contract, and that did behave more or less as expected regarding to the psychological contract breach logic that I already explained previously. Very important question is, we have three professional categories into the academia. You have administrative staff, for those who are perhaps more similar to the population of white-collar workers, and you have two prototypical academic groups, PhD students and postdocs and professors. And now, do they all react alike? Is this something that we can generalize across categories or not? And the interesting bit is that if you look at all chapters, the findings are really rather similar, rather universal, with sometimes here and there smaller limited differences. So I would rather conclude that they all behave similarly with slight deviations here and there. Like PhD students, they have a slightly higher score on burnout complaints. Professors identified stronger with their job, as Eva already showed us. And administrative staff, here we saw that qualitative insecurity was also associated with outcomes, whereas it wasn't that strongly regarding performance outcomes, it wasn't that strongly for the other groups. So there are tiny differences, but more universal, really. So recommendations. Well, job insecurity is present. It has adverse effects, so we need to do something. It needs to be reduced. And one way, of course, is to look at its origin, to look at its source. And there are quite a lot of structural interventions in academia lately, has been summarized by Lara at the start. And these seem to have adverse effects as well. So perhaps we might question some of those. So some of the proposed reforms, we need to look at them very carefully to see whether they are really targeting what we think they target and whether they do not have the opposite effects. Temporary contracts might be reduced, educational demands might be reduced. So we need to work on the structural factors leading to insecurity. That's one. Second, of course, we could strengthen the perception of control, because we know from research that that directly reduces insecurity and also buffers the negative consequences. And some of the variables already discussed today play a role here, because if you strengthen communication and participation, which are parts of justice, and organizational justice perceptions, that might help increasing control perceptions and thus decreasing insecurity and reducing the effects. Also, employability is relevant. The fact that you put efforts into strengthening skills of people so that they might find jobs elsewhere in case they might lose their jobs. And then thirdly, specific support programs have been highlighted by specific authors in the book. Support programs really tailored to the specific needs you find within the academic personnel. To conclude, the take-home message, well, insecurity is part of the academic experience nowadays, and it clearly hinders academia in its mission, as already been highlighted in the introduction of the symposium. It hinders the academic workers in their health, well-being, and so on. It hinders the creation and accumulation of knowledge in the production we do. And it has probably also a very negative effect on the academic education of students. So this is a problem, and so measures need to be taken to reduce insecurity and its consequences. This is in a nutshell, and perhaps too fast, what I wanted to say.
Prof. Hans, it's wonderful. I think you clearly state that this is important. It's an important message to hit home to all those involved in higher education, especially so those in management and in strategic leadership. Thank you so much, Prof. Hans. We'll come back to you, Prof. Hans and Prof. Lara, because we have a question that I was hoping to guide your way related to opportunities that job insecurity opens up for private sector research and so on. But we'll come back to you on that question. I'd love to hear from Prof. Lara on that as well. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's get a bit of a different perspective on this. Someone not involved in writing or editing for this publication. From Switzerland, please welcome Professor Maike de Bos from the Faculty of Science, University of Neuchâtel. Professor Maike, thank you so much for being here this afternoon. we've built up to your presentation now a critical evaluation of the presented volume. Professor, let's hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me, and can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, first of all, I would like to express my thanks for inviting me here today and for providing for having me provide a critical discussion of that lovely book. Because when I had the book in my hands, I really felt like, so my first reaction was like, wow, this is such an important topic, and finally we start doing research about people who do research on job insecurity. I mean, of course, not everyone who's working in academia is doing research on job insecurity, but at least I felt like, wow, there's finally more research that is so much needed about researchers who, as we have seen before, experience so much job insecurity. So yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide a discussion of the book, which I have mainly divided into three different parts. So I'm going to lay out some of the strengths that I saw in the book, and what I really feel like that this project, or kind of things that make this project so unique. There's certainly more I can say about that, but I really wanted to highlight kind of the things that were most important to me when looking at the book. In the second part, I'm going to develop some ideas for the next volume. So I'm not sure if you're planning on doing that, but kind of in terms of what I see as potential things that would be really worth looking at in the next volume, if that is going to be the plan. And then finally, I'm also going to delve into practical implications in sort of, okay, what can we do kind of to make science a better place that gives us more security for those people who are involved. So let's start by talking about or highlighting some of the strengths that I really saw in that book. So first, and I think that's clear, that what we've seen from the previous presentations, we saw statistics, for example, that Eva presented. So this is really, it's a very timely topic. And we saw that also kind of job insecurity is affecting people who are clearly working in the academic sector. And I also really like kind of the fact that in the book, all of the involved researchers looked at the different categories of workers who are working in the academic sector. So I really found that very, very useful and a very nice way to look at these different groups. What I also, like when looking at the book, very much and greatly appreciated is the fact that there was that global scope and collaboration. So overall, there were data from 10 different countries, 26 job insecurity experts were involved. And I think that's really something very, very unique to the book, because when we look at the overall literature that is there on job insecurity, like we see it's very rare to combine such breadth in terms of variables models looked at with, at the same time, that sector-specific focus, which I think was something that was urgently needed to really look at people working in academia. Then third, the point I wanted to highlight is I really greatly appreciated the methodological rigor with which that whole study was conducted. And these were mainly two important things that stood out to me. So first thing I very much appreciated was the fact that the authors came up with that overarching conceptual model. So we saw kind of there was that overarching theoretical foundation that guided the entire research effort. And I also very much like the fact that, and I think that's very important actually, if we want to draw conclusions that are valid and that we can compare across different countries, that the author started with some very profound measurement equivalence analyses. Another thing, and I think this was something that actually was not specifically mentioned in the talks before, so I'm happy that at this point in time I can add something that hasn't been mentioned. What I also kind of greatly appreciated was the fact that the authors looked at attributions of job insecurity. So in one of the chapters, the participants were asked kind of what do you think for you are the causes? Why do you experience job insecurity? And there was a whole list of causes or attributions that the participants in the study could mention. And I think that's very important to look at that part, because I think that, personally speaking, in job insecurity research, we have a very strong focus on looking at what are the outcomes, what are mechanisms, what are moderators. And of course this is very important, but we are kind of, let's say, much less attention has been devoted to actually looking at causes. And of course, still, like, it's attribution, so it's something subjective, but I think it's also very important because it tells us something about why people do feel actually job insecurity. And finally, what I also found very enriching was that the book came up with, or the research came up with both new mediators and new moderators. And what has been mentioned before is that, of course, kind of mediators give us an idea in terms of the underlying mechanism. So it tells us more about kind of why is there a relationship between job insecurity and specific outcomes. And I really like the research that delved into the question of identity threat, and also self-undermining as a relatively new mediator. And also, I mean, Hans mentioned it before that kind of useful moderators are hard to find, yet I also very much enjoyed reading about the different perspectives of justice, so that it can kind of work on different parts of the job insecurity outcome relationship. And I also really like kind of delving into the moderating role of both justice and social capital in that respect. Okay. So as mentioned before, the next part I want to talk about are some ideas that come up, or that I developed if you're planning to have a next volume, so to further kind of enrich that field that we're in. The first thing I was wondering about, and this is something that I think was mentioned in the opening chapter, where Lara, Hans, and Ian kind of alluded to the point that kind of job insecurity per se is not the entire, or not the full part of the story, but maybe we actually need, let's say, a somewhat broader conceptualization of work insecurity, because people can feel or can experience different types of insecurities in the workplace. And the one concept that was alluded to in the book was occupational insecurity. So if people, for example, due to the upsurge of artificial intelligence, feel that their entire occupation may become obsolete. But when we look back into the sector of academic work, I think what's also really important to look at is career insecurity. So if people have the anticipation that kind of they cannot pursue their career in a way how they would want it to be. And I think that's something for people in academia who are, as Eva mentioned, they kind of, we generally identify so strongly with our jobs. However, for many of people working in academia, kind of, they cannot stay in academia as they want to, as they would like to have the career unfold, but they may experience sort of career insecurity. And I think that kind of for the future, it would be really helpful to have sort of a broader conceptualization of the different forms of insecurities that people can experience, with a specific focus on career insecurity in the academic sector. Another idea I developed for future research would be to also kind of have a more broader understanding of precariousness in academia. So to look at kind of how different forms of precarious work conditions or economic stressors intersect. So Hans already mentioned the aspect about kind of the temporary contracts that people in academia are typically in. I think another aspect I find worth mentioning in that context is also that oftentimes people working in academia, specifically kind of lower level faculty, they refer to what we would refer, or they experience what we would refer to as time-based underemployment. So basically kind of, many people in academia are not employed on a full-time working contract, so 100%, but less, because this is so normal in the academic system, which means that basically a lot of people who want to pursue an academic career basically work for free, at least a part of their time. And I think that actually looking at this kind of in combination with job insecurity would be interesting, because it makes kind of the whole situation of working in academia even more precarious. Another aspect I was thinking of in terms of looking into future research would be to also, of course, we need to have an even better understanding of what are the underlying mechanisms. Why do we see these relationships? And I think one mediator that could be specifically interesting with regards to working in academia could be negative self-evaluation. So job insecurity could actually be something that drives the perception that kind of I'm not good enough to work in this job, driving larger or kind of more general negative self-evaluations. And I think it could also give rise to kind of the feeling that, well, if my job is insecure, maybe I'm kind of working in a position or I'm doing something that's not really valued by society or kind of considered to be useful to contributing to the larger society as a whole. And then I have one final point about kind of when we go through the model from left to right. I think also kind of some further outcomes could be interesting here. So I was thinking of, for example, career commitment. So whether job insecurity can also be something that kind of lowers people's career commitment because they feel insecure, they feel they are not valued, they do not see a future in their job, so that maybe kind of they lose commitment in their entire careers. Or, for example, and I mean, this is something we oftentimes see actually, decide to have or to undergo a professional reorientation. So basically to leave academia and find a hopefully more secure position elsewhere. Yeah, so these were my ideas in terms of suggestions, how the topic could be enlarged, perhaps in a future volume. Not sure if there are any plans on that. I finally have some concluding thoughts in terms of the practical implications. And this is also something kind of that aligns with what Hans mentioned before. And it was also mentioned at the beginning that in academia, kind of we have that publish or perish phenomenon oftentimes, or kind of mindset, how we think about this. And I think the book and all the research that was conducted, that wonderful effort here, kind of one message was very clear, that kind of job insecurity really is something that hinders science. So we really must stop thinking that giving people insecurity kind of boosts the productivity. But instead, what we see is that productivity and creativity go down. And I think that's a major threat for science as a whole. So the question is, of course, kind of not only how do we make better science, but more importantly in this context, how can we make science a better place? And for that, I have finally kind of three practical or suggestions, what I think we really need to do. The first thing is what Hans already mentioned, kind of we really need structural and systemic changes. So we need to offer more secure career perspectives to young scholars. So offering more permanent contracts, extending time limits of contracts, and, for example, offering what, for example, the UK is doing, lecturer positions for people at a more earlier stage in their career. But of course, we all know that these structural and systemic changes, it needs time to develop and to be implemented, and also to change the mindsets of the people who are responsible for driving these structural changes. So I think kind of what is really important is that we also think what can we do on a smaller scale. So as leaders and professors in the academic system, kind of I strongly advocate that we invest time and resources in mentoring, coaching, and supporting young scholars to increase employability, not only for staying in the academic market, but perhaps also to find a job elsewhere if these people kind of do not want to stay in the academic system. And finally, I think there is also, of course, responsibility at the level of the universities. So as universities, we need to ask ourselves kind of how can we help scholars to make their skills visible and transferable to fields outside of academia. So for example, I think of doctoral students, and I think doctoral students kind of often have the feeling, or they have the worry that kind of what they do during their PhDs is something that can only be applied to academia. But no, that's certainly not the case. So as people in academia, we have so many skills that are transferable to other fields outside of academia. And I think here it's very important kind of to increase awareness of this, that we have skills, they need to be visible, and how can we transfer those fields to other, or to how can we transfer these skills to fields outside of academia. Okay, I thank you very much for your attention. I hope I kind of stayed in the time limit. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you so much for inviting me here today and for your attention.
Thank you, Prof. Maike. It's wonderful to have that analysis, and we appreciate it. I could see a few of the people nodding in the room. My mag is Maike. It was wonderful. Thank you so much for the insight that you provided. All right, now, ladies and gentlemen, let's get to those question and answers. We have about 50 people in the room here with us, and if you would like to ask a question, just give an indication and I'll come round to you. But online, we also have a few questions. We're going to start with Prof. Hans and Prof. Lara. I'd like to hear what you think of this. Tessa de Wet asked a question about a bit of a positive spin then on job insecurity and perhaps a few opportunities that we might get from it. The question reads, what opportunities does job insecurity open up for private sector research, enterprising and collaboration? Prof. Hans, I'd like you to have a first go at it, and then perhaps also to hear from Prof. Lara. Prof. Hans?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that an opportunity could be to help us develop interventions to tackle job insecurity and help us evaluate the interventions. To be honest, we've been very strong in developing theories and analyzing consequences of job insecurity, but we have difficulties in reaching organizations and trying to implement interventions, develop and evaluate them, simply because the organizations are not always willing to accept us among them and analyze all this. But they can gain a lot of relevant knowledge from doing this kind of intervention evaluations, as well as we can help them doing the evaluations. So there I see a very important opportunity.
Thank you, Prof. Hans. Prof. Lara, if you'd like to contribute as well?
Absolutely, yes. I see it the exact same way as Hans. I think a first important step for organizations would indeed be to acknowledge the problem, because way too often organizations know that there's job insecurity if they undergo a restructuring, but they don't really want to address it because it's also admitting to having this problem. But I think that would be a really important first step, because we have seen that by having these open conversations, by having maybe giving people the opportunity to voice their opinions in this regard, that it can help as a first important step for the people who are affected. But in terms of research, indeed, it would also help to advance research on interventions, because we cannot really conduct this kind of research without the help and the collaboration with the private sector.
Thank you so much, professors. Now moving on to Prof. Eva and Prof. Jurgita. There's a question and a bit of a preamble to it. Let me start with the question. The question is, at what level and with which disciplines we should think about job insecurity in order not to be too naive? So that's the question from Andries Baart. But let me give you the preamble as well. According to leading sociologists and philosophers, job precarity is not an unfortunate side effect of modern institutions, but is deliberately perpetuated by neoliberal policies. You would therefore expect that, in addition to the psychological and personal behavioral variables mentioned, social, sociological, and critical variables would also be included. So back to the question. Andries Baart asks you, at what level and with which disciplines should we think about job insecurity in order not to be too naive? Prof. Eva, if I can come to you first and ask you, what do you think in response to that question?
Thank you very much for this question. I think this is a very valid and very important question. It refers to the question of how much do we need context for understanding individual job insecurity. And I think it's essential to draw this in. I mean, the person who asked the question already gives the answer, right? Sociology, knowledge of sociologists. I would go even broader. I think we need probably theories maybe from even political sciences on understanding the work context, the political context, the life context of people better. Because being job insecure, let's say, in South Africa might mean something different than being job insecure in Germany or in the US. And I think we still understand those relationships way too little. I wouldn't necessarily now try to read into capitalist systems, but there's other ways of structuring this as well. And I think this is definitely an area where we need to understand this better. I think the felt experience of job insecurity, the personal worry will be stressful in whatever country you're in. But how this worry develops will depend on the historic, political, economic, capitalist, democratic, institutional context of your country, I guess. Because we need more knowledge. So if there is anyone listening from political sciences or anthropology or geography or sociology, please reach out. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Eva. Prof. Jurgita?
Thank you very much for the question. Well, I always say that science is powerless against the fantasy of politicians. And I would say that we often have many answers to the questions that are important for our everyday life, for our working life. So I think it's usual way of thinking nowadays that we should employ all kinds of scientific views for understanding certain phenomena. But I always think, and I really try to do my best, like in applying those facts, scientific facts in practice. So I think it's not about the scientific point of view or merging different points, like from of the researchers coming from different fields, but it's more about the will to implement things in practice. I think that we know quite enough. Like, for example, we know that insecurity is harmful. And so if we have it in practice, then we must acknowledge that we will have negative effects. I mean, that's it. We will have impaired job performance. We will have less productivity, less innovative behavior, as we heard today. So I think we just need to employ the knowledge that we have. So that's my point of view.
Thank you so much, Professor Jurgita and Professor Eva. Appreciate your contribution. Now, let's take one last question, and I'd love to hear from Prof. Sebastian, if you'd be so kind, Prof. This question comes from Hans Hendrik Noop, and he poses the question: a little insecurity, like in a sports game, is necessary for fun and performance. A lot hinders productivity. How to find balance in education and work?
Yes, I guess that's the big question, is to find that balance. But I think what we heard here this afternoon is clearly about the negative effects of job insecurity. Yeah, sure, sometimes a bit of insecurity might also be helpful, and I think Hans also referred to that. But yeah, difficult question. I'm not sure that I have the answer to that one. It's about balance, and it's about what the type of context that you create for people.
It seems to, thank you, Prof. Sebastian. Thanks, Prof. Maike. we have another theme here to explore, striking that right balance between a little bit of insecurity, driving performance, and then overreaching and getting too much. Prof. Maike, what do you think about this balance?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think that very often kind of we think that, well, yeah, let's give people a little bit of insecurity and then it helps to kind of boost their performance. But I think this is really something that, I mean, it can work on the short run, but I'm really advocating to be very, very careful here, because we also know that kind of the longer people experience job insecurity, the more harmful it gets. So it really should not be kind of giving people insecurity should not be a means to try to try to boost the performance, because I really think it's something that is very short-sighted. So I think it's important to see, and this is what Hans that we saw in Hans's research that he presented. Kind of, we very clearly saw it's a hindrance stressor, and it has mainly negative effects, and I think that's what we really need to keep in mind.
Thank you so much, Professor. Let me just check from the floor. Anyone? No questions at this moment? Wonderful, because we have reached the end of our discussion on this book, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for all who contributed and partook in our discussion this afternoon. Go and find the book, buy the book, read it, and engage with the authors a little bit more. The book, Global Perspectives on Job Insecurity in Higher Education. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our presentation for the afternoon. Thank you so much for your participation and your attention. All the best.